In a nutshell, I feel like the DAW argument is basically like, hey, do you like to use a SSL 4000 console versus a Neve console versus an API console in your studio, right? Like, they are all DAWs, they all record, they all edit, they all can mix. But the layout and the form factor and how you use the console makes a big difference for some people, and it leads to preferences. So I figured I'd share a few reasons that I prefer to use Luna in my studio. Now, if you're new to Luna or thinking about making the switch, I've put together a complete Luna master course. You can check it out at thestevekinney.com, along with other tools like UAD presets, SSL and Stream Deck control profiles, and ways to book one-on-one time with me directly to help with your productions. With that said, let's get started. The first thing that really kind of comes to mind is like, all right, the industry standard is Pro Tools. And there's a real reason for that. Obviously, there's Pro Tools HDX, but those systems cost an arm and a leg, and they have a real problem to solve. And it's not always something that makes sense for a smaller studio like the kind of studio that I work out of here, right? I'm doing all my mixing here. I'm not tracking massive bands. I go to session studios for that. And those session studios have a real need for no latency. They have large input counts and they need a lot of Q mixes. HDX solves that problem. Now in the home studio, you still run into those problems, right? If you have a session like the one I have pulled up has probably 60 tracks in it, all with processing, eventually you're gonna get into a situation where you're gonna have latency if you try to add a track and turn on input monitoring with your standard USB interfaces. So obviously, Apollo is kind of the main answer for that. Yeah, there's plenty of other devices out there that kind of manage that similarly with hardware monitoring, but they don't have the ability to monitor with plugins. So like being on the Apollo itself is kind of a big deal for me, which brings me to the first main point, and that is integrated Apollo control. So whenever you're working around in the mixer, you have complete control of the Apollo. Now, like the one thing that everybody talks about is the preamps and unison, but I don't often see a lot of people pointing out and talking about how it's also your Q sends and your auxiliary sends. It's just baked into the mixer. So that becomes a lot easier. You don't have to have, Pro Tools up and then go to another window and look at UAD Console. So really that for me is kind of a really big deal. Now, of course, there's Pro Tools Carbon, right? Why am I not on Pro Tools Carbon? Because that would kind of be a similar thing. Well, the truth is kind of the network effect. I've been on Apollo for a long time. I've been on Apollo since before Pro Tools Carbon came out. And so I'm kind of just baked into the ecosystem. I like it. I think it sounds great. I'm familiar with it. The next one is kind of like the chef's kiss of why I really like being in Luna, and that's automatic DSP switching. Now, obviously, we've talked about the latency thing, and you go to arm a track and make the input source active. In that scenario, Luna automatically turns on and manages everything it needs to manage for your live signal to be running with DSP-enabled plugins. But what happens when you turn off input monitoring? Well, any UAD2 plugins that have a UADX counterpart automatically switches to CPU-based processing with UADX native plugins. Now that is so cool and so useful for not just my Apollo. I have the X8, which is 6 DSP cores, but for smaller Apollos like the Apollo Solo, you get so much more runway with processing in your sessions if you're able to automatically switch back and forth. In so many words, it kind of makes the Apollos more powerful now that you can be able to switch back and forth in real time whenever you arm a track. So that's a big one for me. And you can't really do that in any other DAW. That's not possible in Studio One. That's not possible in Logic. You have to manually turn off the other plugins that are DSP enabled and copy the settings over to a native plugin. So again, that's kind of a big workflow hack and a big life hack in general. That function has even made its way into my template for the UF Control series. Like I have a button that's dedicated to converting every plugin in my session to UADX and vice versa. So that's again, a huge one for me. All right, now the third one is really very much the thing we talked about at the very, very top of the video, the analog inspired workflow, right? For me, it feels like the most true to life of working on a desk or like a console desk, right? They're trying to make all of your decisions and workflow feel like that with the way they've laid the mixer out. Now, again, it's all imaginary. It's still a DAW, right? But the way you work and the way you lay things out on screen makes you kind of feel like you're in that environment. And I'll give you a great analogy is like when you pull up an 1176 plugin and it's got the input and the output and the attack and the release, and the way that it's laid out on screen, it makes you feel like you're working with an 1176. If it was just like sliders and it looked like a box that had sliders, you wouldn't really feel like you were using an 1176. You know, there is something to feeling like you're in that environment. So for me, it's easy on the eyes, I can get around easy, and I'm happy to work in the program for hours upon hours. Next, let's talk about AI. I think a lot of musicians would think AI and music go together like oil and water. It's not going anywhere, it's not going away, and so I think it's cool that Universal Audio has found a way to embrace it in a manner that is additive to the experience of using a DAW. Genuinely, there's been numerous times where I'm alone here in the studio and I need to record a background vocal or an acoustic guitar, and I like to use the ISO booth for that. It sounds better than this room, and the voice control makes it so great that I can just tell the transport section to start, essentially. I don't need somebody else to be in the control room, and I don't need to bring my keyboard and mouse in with me and, you know, kind of do that weird dance. I can sit right where I need to sit in front of the mic and just activate recording. It's great. I also really do enjoy the instrument detection function as well, because anytime I'm going to the session studios, right, I'm bringing back a bunch of tracks and they're labeled accordingly, right? So I don't necessarily need the names from the auto detection, but what's really cool is the color coordination. So I drag them in and it automatically color coordinates everything. That saves me a bunch of time because there's no shortcut to pop open the color selector for the tracks. So it'd take a minute to just manually go through that. And that's one less thing that I have to do that's a repetitive task. And of course, it also selects the warping algorithm, which again, it's a repetitive task. It's one less click and it speeds me along. I like that. I think the most interesting thing that no one's really talking about here with Luna is the cost. So the standard price for Luna is $0 goose egg, right? What do you get with that? Well, you get the program and you get shape and you get oxide tape summing, right? Like you get a couple things with that. So it's free, right? You can record, no problem. But if you really want like Luna, right? If you want the full experience, you gotta buy Luna Pro. So I see it as like a free and a paid category. That's like totally the same as things like Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve and a number of other professional applications at this point. They have like a free version that has some limitations, and then they have the paid version, which is the full version. This is really no different. But one thing that is kind of like oh, I never thought of it that way, is say you buy Logic, right? You spend $200 on Logic. Well, you get Logic and a bunch of stock plugins. You're absolutely gonna go out and you're probably gonna go and buy a bunch of Universal Audio plugins, some SSL plugins, some kit plugins, etc., right? You're gonna go and get those. If you buy Luna, you're getting them anyway, right? You're getting the program and you're also getting the ATR 102, you're getting Studer, you're getting 1176, you're getting all sorts of stuff that you're gonna probably want anyway for $129 when they run that sale, or $200. So I just think it's a crazy value if you think about it, which, you know, again, I hadn't really considered until I had to sit here and think about, you know, people switching over to it. Now, obviously, it's still a young program. There's going to be things that are evolving and changing as it matures. You can try to make the comparative analysis of like, you know, Luna versus Logic, but it's kind of hard to make that comparison because obviously Logic's been around for way longer. You know, same with Pro Tools. Obviously, there are workflow related things that Pro Tools has that Luna just doesn't have yet. But for all intents and purposes, I've been releasing music with it for years now. I haven't really run into those problems. I mean, I will say I ran into a problem of all the, you know, the hardware inserts. That was a bit of a pain point for me for a long time. Obviously, I have a bunch of gear here and I like to use it. So I'm glad that I can now. That's really exciting. But beyond that, I think it's such a fun program to be in. It's gonna continue to mature and become a more in-depth program. And it's a good time to jump in and follow along through that journey and give your feedback. That's another really cool thing, that the devs are actively listening to user feedback. So if you use it and you use the feedback menu, like they're gonna hear your ideas and they're gonna find ways to implement them. I think that that's great. Because I know for a fact, if I tried to give my feedback to Pro Tools and the people at Avid, no one would hear me. So that's some of the biggest reasons that I continue to use Luna in my studio. Let me know what you like about Luna. If you don't like it, what's holding you back? For all the new Luna users looking to take your Luna knowledge to the bleeding edge of what it can do as a DAW, check out my official Luna master course at thestevekinney.com. With it, you get a dedicated knowledge base that updates as Luna evolves. Plus, you get my advanced SSL control profile and Luna Stream Deck profile, so you can learn with the tools that I use right alongside me. Love to see you there. I'd love to be a part of your Luna journey. Don't forget, you can always find my other tools, profiles, or book one-on-one time with me directly at thestevekinney.com. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Cheers.